13,000 years ago, in a cave in what is now northern Israel, a group of hunter-gatherers brewed beer, not wine, not fermented fruit juice, beer, made from wheat and barley, in stone mortars carved into the cave floor, inside a burial site, while they were still nomadic, 3,000 years before anyone farmed a single crop. Li Lu, archaeologist at Stanford University, analyzed the residue left in those stone mortars in 2018. Her conclusion, published in the Journal of Archaeological Science. This is the oldest record of man-made alcohol in the world. The cave is called Raqefet. The people are called the Natufians. And what they were doing in that cave will rearrange something fundamental about the story of civilization you were taught. Because you were taught that early humans settled down to grow grain so they could make bread. Bread came first. Then beer, as a side project. Civilization = hunger solved first, leisure later. That is not what the evidence says. The evidence says the people at Raqefet Cave were brewing beer 3,000 years before anyone in their region had domesticated a single grain of wheat, which raises a question that 70 years of archaeological debate has not fully settled. Which came first, beer or bread? And why does the answer completely change the story of why civilization exists at all? That is what this video is about. Act 1. The Raqefet Cave. Let us start with the cave, because the details are extraordinary. And they matter in the same way that 4 charred tobacco seeds in Utah mattered in the last video. Small details, enormous implication. Raqefet Cave sits in the Carmel Mountains near what is now Haifa, in northern Israel. Archaeologists first discovered it in 1956. For decades, it was studied primarily as a burial site. And it is a remarkable one. 30 individuals buried here, their skeletons laid on beds of freshly picked flowers. We know this because the impressions of the stems are still preserved in the sediment. Animal bones, flint tools, stone implements worn smooth from use. The people who buried their dead in this cave are called the Natufians. They lived in this part of the world between roughly 15,000 and 11,500 years ago. They were not farmers. They were nomadic or semi-nomadic. They moved with the seasons. They hunted, they gathered, and they buried their dead in caves decorated with flowers, which is already more sophisticated than you might expect from people living 13,000 years ago. But in 2018, a team led by Li Lu from Stanford found something in the cave that nobody had been specifically looking for. They analyzed 3 large stone mortars embedded in the cave floor, not portable bowls. These were permanent, carved directly into the stone, fixed in place. Inside those mortars, starch residues and microscopic plant particles called phytolith. Both are produced during a very specific process, specifically the process of turning grain into alcohol. The team found evidence of all 3 stages of brewing, preserved in the residue of those stone mortars. Stage 1. Malting. The grain, wheat and barley was soaked in water, then drained, dried, and stored. This step causes the grain to begin germinating, which converts starches into fermentable sugars. Stage 2. Mashing. The malted grain was ground, heated, mixed with water. The sugars became accessible. Stage 3. Fermentation. The mash was left to sit. Wild airborne yeast, the same yeast that exists naturally in the environment, found the sugars and converted them into alcohol. No domesticated yeast, no controlled temperature, no hydrometer to measure alcohol content, no recipes written down. Just grain, water, stone, knowledge passed down through generations and time. What came out was not beer as you know it. Not cold, not carbonated, not hoppy. More like a thick, warm, slightly sour, mildly alcoholic porridge. Alcohol content probably between 1 and 3%. Li Lu called it the oldest record of man-made alcohol in the world. And here is the detail that stops you. This happened inside a burial site, surrounded by the dead, by people who were still nomadic, who had not yet figured out that staying in one place and farming grain was something they could do. They were brewing beer before they were farming, before they had decided to settle down, before civilization, as we understand the word, had begun. Act 2. Why did they do it? Now the real question. The Natufians at Raqefet Cave were nomadic hunter-gatherers. They moved with the seasons. Every object they owned had to be worth carrying. Every investment of time and energy had to justify itself. Malting grain, mashing it, fermenting it, this is not a trivial process. It takes days. It requires specific knowledge. It requires returning to the same location with the intention of producing something. Why would nomadic people invest that kind of effort in a brewing operation built into a burial cave? The answer archaeologists have converged on: ritual feasting. Not casual drinking, not recreation, but ceremony. The deliberate creation of an altered state in the context of the most important social event their community knew how to organize, honoring the dead. This fits a pattern we have now seen repeatedly across the ancient world. In video 5, we looked at how tobacco first appeared in the archaeological record as a social and ritual substance, not recreational but ceremonial. Cannabis in the Drunken Cemetery, buried with the dead, elevated THC, used in the context of ritual. Opium in Mesopotamia, embedded in the feasting practices of temple culture. Every time early humans found a substance that altered how they experienced the world, they did not use it casually on a Tuesday afternoon. They wrapped it in ceremony. They embedded it in the most significant social events they had. And death, apparently, was one of those events. But alcohol was doing something that the other substances were not. Oliver Dietrich, archaeologist at the German Archaeological Institute, has studied feasting behavior at ancient sites for decades. In a 2012 paper in the journal Antiquity, he wrote directly, "Production and consumption of alcoholic beverages is an important factor in feasts facilitating the cohesion of social groups." Cohesion of social groups. That phrase is doing a lot of work. In a world before money, before law, before government, before any of the formal institutions we use to organize people, the feast was how you got humans to cooperate. You wanted someone to help you hunt. You wanted a neighboring group to not attack you. You wanted people to show up and do something difficult together. You threw a feast. You shared food. You shared drink. And whatever you shared had better be worth showing up for. Alcohol specifically is exceptionally good at this. It lowers social barriers. It creates a shared experience. It generates the sensation of trust and belonging in people who might otherwise be strangers or rivals. Humans who could use alcohol to facilitate social cooperation could do things that humans who could not do this simply could not accomplish. And what they did next was the most astonishing thing any group of humans had ever attempted. Act 3, Göbekli Tepe and the thing that should not exist. In 1994, a German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt was surveying a barren hilltop in southeastern Turkey. He expected to find nothing particularly interesting. What he found was the oldest monumental structure on Earth. The site is called Göbekli Tepe, and it should not exist. Massive T-shaped stone pillars, some of them more than 5 meters tall and weighing up to 10 tons, arranged in circular enclosures, carved with extraordinary precision foxes, snakes, bulls, vultures, scorpions in relief that suggests real artistic skill, not crude markings, sophisticated, intentional, beautiful work. Göbekli Tepe is roughly 11,000 to 12,000 years old. That means it predates the pyramids of Giza by 7,000 years. It predates Stonehenge by 6,000 years. It predates the invention of writing by 6,000 years. It predates pottery, and it was built by people who had not yet invented agriculture. Think about what it takes to build something like Göbekli Tepe. You need hundreds of people, coordinated over a long period of time, cutting, transporting, and placing 10-ton stones, feeding all those workers, housing them, keeping them focused on a single project when their biological imperative was to hunt and gather and move. But these people were nomadic. No village, no permanent settlement, no centralized authority, no payroll, no government to conscript labor. How do you get hundreds of nomadic people to converge on the same hilltop and work together for years? The answer that archaeologists have increasingly settled on is the one that Göbekli Tepe itself provides. In 2012, Oliver Dietrich and his team analyzed the large limestone vessels found at the site. Stone troughs, some with capacities of up to 160 liters. They found calcium oxalate residue inside. Calcium oxalate is produced during a specific chemical process, the soaking, mashing, and fermenting of grain. 6 massive brewing troughs at the world's oldest monumental site. In a ceremonial ritual context, 11,000 years ago, Dietrich wrote, "The production and consumption of alcoholic beverages was an important factor in organizing the collective work at Göbekli Tepe." In other words, the oldest monument on Earth may have been built by people who were paid in beer. People walked for days, possibly weeks, from scattered settlements across the region to come to this hilltop and do something that required enormous effort and produced no immediate survival benefit. The structures at Göbekli Tepe are not storage, not shelter, not practical in any obvious way. They are ceremonial. They are monuments. They are the first evidence of humans doing something, not because they had to, but because it mattered to them. And the thing that got them there, the thing that held the cooperation together, was the feast. And at the center of the feast, the stone troughs full of grain-based beer. If you have ever agreed to do something difficult because someone promised there would be drinks afterward, you are 11,000 years behind the trend. Act 4. Beer before bread. This brings us to the debate. Because Göbekli Tepe and Raqefet Cave together put enormous pressure on a theory that has been the foundation of how we teach civilization. The standard story goes like this. Humans were hungry. They discovered that grain could be cultivated. They settled down to grow it. They made bread. They built villages. Villages became cities. Cities became civilization. Hunger, farming, bread, settlement, culture. This is the version that appears in textbooks. It is logical. It makes sense. Hungry people solve their hunger problem. Then they build culture on top of that foundation. The problem is the archaeological evidence. In 1953, the American Anthropological Association published a now famous symposium titled, "Did Man Once Live by Beer Alone?" Several researchers had begun noticing something uncomfortable. At the earliest known agricultural sites in the Fertile Crescent, the tools being used and the grain varieties being grown were more consistent with brewing than baking. Jonathan Sauer, a botanist from Wisconsin who participated in the symposium, put it bluntly, thirst rather than hunger may have been the stimulus behind the origin of small grain agriculture. At the time, this was a fringe idea, interesting but speculative. There was no physical evidence. Then came Raqefet Cave. Beer making at Raqefet predates agriculture in the Levant by at least 3,000 years. Nomadic people were brewing beer before they were farming. Then came Göbekli Tepe, the world's oldest monument, built with grain beer as the apparent social lubricant. Then came a site in northeastern Jordan, where archaeologists found charred remains of bread baked by Natufians, roughly 13,000 years ago, around the same time as the Raqefet beer, which means bread and beer were both happening before agriculture, before settlement, before domestication. And the question archaeologists have been arguing about since 1953 suddenly has a much more interesting set of evidence attached to it. If bread came first, why were nomadic people investing in fixed brewing equipment in burial caves? If survival was the primary motivation, why does Göbekli Tepe, a site with no obvious survival function, appear 11,000 years ago with 160-liter brewing troughs? Brian Hayden, an archaeologist at Simon Fraser University, has made this argument directly. The buzz induced from beer, along with its high caloric content, would have motivated early farmers to grow cereals. His argument: people did not settle down to grow grain for food. They settled down to grow enough grain to throw the kind of feast that would make enough people cooperative enough to build things together. Beer did not come after civilization. Beer may have been the mechanism that made civilization possible. Act 5. The Drunken Monkey. But here is a deeper layer. Because 13,000 years old is not how far back our relationship with alcohol goes. Robert Dudley is a professor of biology at UC Berkeley. He has spent 25 years thinking about one question: why do humans like alcohol at all? Not historically, evolutionarily. His answer, published in a 2014 book called The Drunken Monkey, is that our attraction to alcohol did not begin with Natufian brewers in a cave. It began 60 million years ago, when our primate ancestors were living in trees, eating fruit, in tropical forests. Here is what happens to fruit in a tropical forest. It ripens. And when it ripens, wild yeast begins consuming the sugars. The sugars convert to ethanol, the same molecule in every alcoholic drink you have ever had. Ripe fruit contains naturally occurring alcohol, usually between 1 and 3% by volume. Now imagine you are a small primate in a dense tropical forest trying to find food. Ripe fruit is the most calorie-dense thing available. But you cannot see through the vegetation. The forest is thick. You cannot check every tree. What you can do is smell. Ethanol is a light molecule. It evaporates from ripe fruit and disperses through the air. If you have evolved sensitivity to the smell of ethanol, you can detect ripe fruit from a significant distance even when you cannot see it. The primates who were best at smelling ethanol found more ripe fruit, found more calories, survived better, had more offspring. Over 60 million years, the primates who became humans were selected for a powerful, genetically embedded attraction to the smell of alcohol. Not to alcohol itself, to ripe fruit. Alcohol was the signal. In 2022, primatologist Christina Campbell at California State University Northridge collected fruit eaten by wild spider monkeys in Panama. She measured the ethanol content, between 1 and 2% by volume. And she collected urine from the monkeys and confirmed they were metabolizing the alcohol from the fruit. Dudley's hypothesis confirmed: wild primates actively seek out and eat fermented fruit. They are not getting drunk. The concentration is too low, but they are consistently, preferentially choosing the food that smells of fermentation. The same smell that is in your glass of wine. The same smell that drifts from a brewery. The same smell that made some part of your brain say yes, that when you first encountered alcohol. You do not like the smell of alcohol. You like the smell of ripe fruit. Your brain simply has not been updated since the Oligocene epoch. Act 6. The full timeline. Let us put this together. 60 million years ago, primate ancestors begin selecting for ethanol sensitivity. The genetic preference is built in. It becomes part of what we are. 13,000 years ago, the Natufians at Raqefet Cave, Israel, deliberately brew grain-based beer for ritual feasting in a burial site. This is the oldest confirmed man-made alcohol in the world. It predates agriculture in their region by 3,000 years. 12,000 years ago, hunter-gatherers at Göbekli Tepe, Turkey, use enormous stone brewing troughs to produce beer for communal feasts that organize the construction of the world's oldest monument, a structure that should not exist yet. built by people who had no other obvious reason to cooperate at that scale. 10,000 years ago, grain is domesticated in the Fertile Crescent. The agricultural revolution begins. Whether beer or bread drove this remains debated. The evidence increasingly points toward beer. 5,000 years ago, the Sumerians of Mesopotamia brew beer at industrial scale. They write about it in the oldest written texts we have. They compose hymns to Ninkasi, the goddess of beer. Workers constructing the pyramids of Giza receive beer as part of their daily wage, approximately 4 to 5 liters per person per day. Let that sit for a moment. The pyramids were partially built on beer rations. And somewhere between all of this and your Friday evening at a bar, something changed. Not the biology, not the attraction, not the underlying evolutionary preference for the molecule that once meant ripe fruit and available calories. What changed was the context. In the ancient world, alcohol was seasonal and scarce, embedded in ritual and ceremony, controlled by community and occasion, a social technology for cooperation rather than an escape from daily life. In the modern world, alcohol is available everywhere at any hour, separated from ritual, consumed individually rather than communally, and frequently used as a mechanism for escaping a life rather than celebrating it. Same molecule, same 60-million-year-old attraction, completely different context. And as we established in the last video, context is everything. Plot twist, here is the thing nobody says directly about the beer before bread hypothesis. If it is correct, if early humans were motivated to settle down and farm not by hunger, but by the desire to produce enough beer to sustain the feasts that made large-scale cooperation possible, then the story of civilization is not primarily a story about survival. It is a story about the human need to come together, to share something, to be part of something larger than the daily search for food. The Natufians at Raqefet Cave were burying their dead and brewing beer. They were not being practical. They were doing something that served no immediate survival function. They were performing a ceremony. They were saying, this person mattered. We are going to mark this moment together. We are going to do something deliberate and human in the face of death. The builders of Göbekli Tepe were carving stone monuments on a hilltop that served no shelter function, no agricultural function, no survival function. They were doing something that required extraordinary cooperation, driven by something other than hunger. The oldest monument on Earth was not built by desperate people trying to survive. It was built by people who needed a reason to cooperate at scale, and found that reason in the feast, in the beer, in the shared experience of being together and doing something that mattered to all of them. Which is the most human thing you can imagine. Your Friday night drink is the same impulse that moved 10-ton stones, 13,000 years old, 60 million years in the making, and you thought it was just a glass of wine. If this changed how you think about why you drink or why civilization exists at all, the like button is right there. Next video, we are going to find out what ancient humans actually ate. The answer involves a category of food that modern nutrition has spent decades demonizing. And when you see what prehistoric humans were actually eating, based on isotope analysis, dental wear patterns, and the remains found at sites like these, the picture is going to look very different from either what you eat today or what anyone is trying to sell you. It drops next week. Subscribe so you do not miss it.